All right, let's dive into radical candor today. I know you guys are all about building amazing teams, and this deep dive, it's going to be right up your alley, seriously. We're going deep on Kim Scott's book, and we've got a super helpful YouTube summary, too, so we've got all our bases covered. This isn't just some theoretical stuff, though. We're going to dig out the practical stuff that you can actually use, like tomorrow.
Yeah, the core of radical candor, it's really pretty simple. It's all about balancing how much you care about your team with giving them direct feedback. Now, that's not always easy, obviously, and that's why we're here to break it down in a way that actually makes sense for your leadership challenges. The stuff you're dealing with every day.
You know that story in the beginning of the book about Kim being in Moscow? Man, that really hooked me. She was trying to, recruit these Russian diamond cutters, and she figured, just offer a ton of money and they'll be on board, right? But
yeah. It turns out what they really wanted was someone who genuinely cared about them, not just as employees, but as people. She ended up having picnics with them, just hanging out, talking about their lives outside of work, and that personal connection, it built a level of trust that money just couldn't buy.
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
You'd think in the business world, it's all about the bottom line. But...
This points to something much deeper about what really motivates us, what makes people tick.
For sure.
And the radical candor framework really builds on this. It's not just about being nice, okay? It's about caring enough to give that honest feedback, even when it's difficult. And that's where those 4 quadrants come in.
Okay, yeah. Let's dive into those. So we got radical candor itself, obviously. That's the ideal. But then there are the pitfalls, right? Ruinous empathy, obnoxious aggression, and manipulative insincerity.
It's almost like a map, like a map for how your feedback is landing on the other person. So let's start with a classic example of radical candor from the book. Kim's boss, Cheryl, giving her feedback about saying too much during presentations.
Oh, man. Yeah, I can see how that could go wrong so easily. Was Cheryl, just brutally honest? Or how did she make it work?
So Cheryl praised the content of Kim's presentation first, to show that she cared, that she wasn't just picking on her. But then she directly addressed those explaining how they were kind of undermining the message. It wasn't sugar-coated, but the care was definitely there.
So it's about being direct, but with the person's best interests in mind, right? Okay, but what if Cheryl had only focused on the ums? And left out the praise? Wouldn't that just be obnoxious aggression?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a story in the book about a Silicon Valley boss who would praise people by mass email when they got bonuses. But the thing is, he'd just copy and paste these justifications from their managers, and some of them, they were actually offensive. So classic obnoxious aggression, right? Trying to praise people, but doing it in a thoughtless way, even a hurtful way.
Ouch. Yeah, that's got to backfire. All right, so we've seen the good, we've seen the bad. What about manipulative insincerity? I feel like that's a trap a lot of us fall into, wanting to be liked.
Oh, it's so tempting. But ultimately, it really hurts your team. Kim Scott talks about Johnny Ive at Apple, who admitted that he avoided challenging his team because he just wanted to be liked. And Steve Jobs actually had to step in and say, look, this is hurting the team's growth.
It's a good reminder, yeah. Sometimes true care means having those tougher conversations. Okay, so what about ruinous empathy? That one seems kind of tricky.
It's the classic nice guy trap, let's say you see someone on your team making a mistake and you don't say anything to avoid upsetting them. You think you're being kind, but you're holding them back.
So even if my intentions are good, if I'm avoiding those tough conversations, that could be just as bad as being aggressive.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where understanding these 4 quadrants can be really helpful. It gives you a framework for looking at your own style and making sure your feedback is landing in that sweet spot of radical candor.
It's like having a compass,
yeah,
right, for those tricky conversations. But, okay, knowing the quadrants, that's just the first step. How do you actually put this into practice? How do you have those tough conversations without someone having a meltdown?
One of the helpful tools that Kim Scott talks about is the get stuff done wheel, which it basically outlines a process for making decisions together. It's not just about, you giving orders. It's about getting everyone on board.
Okay, so we're shifting gears a little bit here, moving from individual feedback to team dynamics. Tell me more about this get stuff done wheel.
So the first step is it's listening. like really creating that space where your team feels safe to share their ideas. Then you move into clarifying, making sure everyone's on the same page about what those ideas actually mean.
It sounds like you're really laying the groundwork for a productive discussion, not just, jumping into debate mode right away.
Exactly. Then you get to the debating part, encouraging healthy disagreement, having people explore all the different perspectives.
Okay, so this is where people can finally, voice their opinions and challenge each other. But how do you make sure that stays productive? How do you make sure the debate doesn't devolve into chaos?
That's where the next step comes in, deciding. And this isn't about you dictating the solution.
Okay.
It's about getting everyone's input, weighing the options, and making an informed choice as a team.
That's a big shift, right?
Yeah.
From that traditional top-down leadership style. It sounds like it requires a lot of trust in your team's judgment.
It does, it does. And that trust, that's what radical candor is all about. But the wheel keeps going. Once the decision is made, it's time for persuading. This is where you bring everyone on board, explaining why the decision was made, addressing any concerns.
So it's not just about majority rules then. It's about making sure everyone
Yeah.
understands why the decision was made and feels comfortable moving forward.
Exactly. Then comes the action, right? Executing the plan. And finally, and this is so important, learning. Reflecting on what worked, what didn't, and how to improve for next time.
That's interesting. It's like a continuous loop, not just a linear process. This get stuff done wheel.
Yeah.
It sounds like it could really prevent those situations where a decision is made, but then half the team is dragging their feet because they don't feel like they were heard.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It builds buy-in at every stage, it's essential for any team to function. And this ties into another important concept that Kim Scott discusses. It's about understanding the difference between rock stars and superstars on your team.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these rock stars and superstars. Is this like some kind of ranking system?
Yeah.
Who gets the bigger bonuses?
Not at all. It's about recognizing that different people on your team, they have different needs, different aspirations. Your rock stars, those are the steady, reliable folks. They're consistent performers, and they're content with their current roles.
They're like the backbone of the team, the ones you can always count on.
Exactly. Now your superstars, they're more ambitious. They're growth oriented. They're always looking for new challenges, opportunities to learn new skills.
Oh, okay. So it's not about who's better. It's about understanding their motivations. So how do you figure out who's a rock star and who's a superstar in your team? Do you just ask them point blank?
Kim Scott, she highlights a great example of how to do this. Russ Laraway, the co-founder of Radical Candor Incorporated, he uses 3 key questions in what he calls career conversations. They help you understand what makes each person on your team tick.
Okay, all right. I'm all ears. What are these magic questions, and how do they help you figure out who's who?
The first question is, what's your life story? It helps you understand their background, their values, what's shaped their worldview. It's not about prying. It's about connecting on a deeper level.
Yeah, that's a great way to build rapport. To understand their motivations beyond just their current job. Okay, what's the next question?
Then he asks, what are your dreams? This encourages them to think about their long-term goals, their aspirations, both personally and professionally.
It goes beyond that typical, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Yeah.
Tossed to the rest. It's about, uncovering their passions and helping them connect those passions to their work.
Exactly. And the final question is, what's your 18-month plan?
Hmm.
This brings it down to concrete steps.
So you're moving from big picture dreams to actionable goals. That's a great way to help them, translate their aspirations into a clear roadmap. But honestly, finding the time for these in-depth conversations, that feels impossible sometimes. How am I supposed to fit that all in?
Yeah, time is a constant challenge. And that's why Kim Scott, she has some really specific advice about making meetings more effective. We've all been in those meetings that just feel like a waste of time, right?
Oh, tell me about it. So what's the secret to making meetings actually productive? Does Kim Scott have some magic formula?
It's less about magic and more about being intentional, I think. She breaks down different types of meetings, each with a clear purpose. For example, one-on-ones. Those are crucial for building that personal connection and giving that direct feedback we've been talking about.
Right. Those are non-negotiables.
Yeah.
But what about those larger team meetings? The ones where everyone's supposed to be on the same page. Those are the ones that often go off the rails for me.
Yeah, for that, she recommends staff meetings. They're great for sharing updates, clarifying information, addressing any roadblocks. The key is to have a clear agenda and stick to it.
Okay. That sounds way more organized than the free-for-alls I'm used to. So staff meetings are for updates, alignment. What about those big decisions that need, real discussion and debate?
Kim Scott suggests separating the debate from the decision itself. So you might have like a debate meeting where everyone can freely share their opinions, explore all the different options without the pressure of having to make a final decision right then and there.
That makes a lot of sense. It allows for more thoughtful discussion, and it prevents people from feeling like they have to take sides too early. So, okay, after the debate, how do you actually make the decision?
That's when you'd have a separate meeting, a big decision meeting. You gather all the relevant information, weigh the pros and cons, and come to a consensus as a team.
It sounds like a much more structured, strategic approach than what I'm used to. But I got to admit, with all these different types of meetings, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed. How do I avoid spending my entire week in meetings and still get actual work done?
Kim Scott, she really emphasizes the importance of being mindful of time, both yours and your team's time. She recommends setting clear time limits for each meeting, having specific agendas, and minimizing distractions.
That sounds like good advice for any meeting, honestly. But beyond just the logistics, there's also the human element, right? We've been talking a lot about giving feedback and challenging others, but
Yeah.
what about the leader's well-being?
You've hit on a crucial point there. Kim Scott stresses that you can't pour from an empty cup, right? If you're not taking care of yourself, it's going to be really difficult to effectively care for and challenge others.
So how do we as leaders make time for self-care when we're already juggling a million things? I mean, is it even possible?
Kim Scott offers some practical advice in the book, like scheduling personal time, even if it's, just a few minutes each day, and identifying activities that replenish you, whether it's exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, whatever works for you.
It's about being proactive
Yeah.
and making those activities a non-negotiable part of your schedule, rather than waiting until you're completely burned out and then trying to squeeze them in as an afterthought.
Exactly. And it's also about being honest with yourself and your team about your emotions.
That can be tough, especially in a leadership role. I mean, there's often this pressure to project an image of, strength and composure.
I hear you. But Kim Scott argues that acknowledging your own vulnerability can actually strengthen your relationships and build trust. It shows your team that you're human, and it creates space for them to be more open about their own challenges.
It's like that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Showing your human side can actually make you a more effective leader.
Exactly. And this ties into another crucial aspect of radical candor. Empowering your team. It's about shifting from a command and control style to a more, collaborative and trusting approach.
That makes sense. If you're constantly micromanaging and second-guessing your team, you're basically sending the message that you don't trust their judgment.
Right. And that can stifle creativity, innovation, and ultimately their growth.
So how do we empower our teams in a way that aligns with these principles of radical candor?
One key step is to clearly define roles and responsibilities, making sure everyone understands how their individual contributions fit into the bigger picture.
That seems pretty basic. But you'd be surprised how often that gets overlooked. I mean, when people don't understand their role, it can lead to confusion, frustration, and duplicated effort.
Absolutely. And once those roles are clear, it's important to delegate effectively, giving people the authority to make decisions within their area of expertise.
That could be tough for some leaders, though. Letting go of control, that can feel scary, especially if you're used to, doing things a certain way.
It can. But remember, the goal isn't to control every aspect of your team's work, right? It's to create an environment where they can thrive. And that often means giving them the freedom to make their own decisions and to learn from their mistakes.
But trusting them to figure things out, even if they don't do it exactly the way you would.
Exactly. And that's where that balance of caring personally and challenging directly comes into play again. You're not just throwing them into the deep end and hoping for the best, You're there to provide guidance, support, and feedback along the way.
It's about being a coach, not a dictator, helping them develop their skills and confidence while still holding them accountable for their performance.
Precisely. And this ties back to the concept of walk stars and superstars. Empowering your team allows each person to shine in their own way, whether they're seeking stability or, rapid growth.
It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued and have the opportunity to contribute their unique strengths.
Yeah.
But let's be honest. Even with the best intentions, things don't always go smoothly, right?
Hmm.
What about those situations where like conflict arises within the team? How do we handle those in a way that aligns with radical candor?
That's a great question. Kim Scott, she really emphasizes the importance of addressing conflict directly and openly, rather than, sweeping it under the rug or hoping it will just resolve itself.
But how do you do that without making things worse? Conflict can be so emotionally charged. It's easy for things to escalate quickly.
One helpful tip is to focus on the behavior of the issue at hand, rather than making it personal.
So instead of saying like you're always so negative, you might say, I've noticed that you've expressed concerns about this project several times. Can you share more about your specific concerns?
Exactly. That shifts the focus from attacking the person to understanding their perspective. And it's also crucial to encourage active listening.
So not just waiting for your turn to speak,
Hmm.
but really trying to understand the other person's point of view, even if you disagree with it.
Precisely. And that often involves asking clarifying questions, summarizing what you've heard to make sure you understand, and validating their feelings even if you don't necessarily agree with their actions.
It's about creating a safe space where
Hmm.
people feel heard and respected, even when there's disagreement.
Exactly. And that's where those one-on-one meetings we discussed earlier, they can be incredibly valuable. They provide a dedicated time and space to have those deeper conversations, address concerns, and build stronger relationships.
Right? Those one-on-ones, they're not just for status updates. They're for connecting on a human level
Mm.
and building that foundation of trust that's essential for radical candor to work. But I'm curious, how do we apply these principles to larger group meetings? We talked about staff meetings and decision-making meetings, but are there other types of meetings where radical candor can be like particularly impactful?
Kim Scott, she also emphasizes the importance of all hands meetings.
Those big company-wide gatherings, I gotta admit, I usually dread those. They often feel like a one-way information dump.
Yeah, I hear you. But Kim Scott suggests using them as an opportunity for two-way communication, where leaders can share updates, of course, but also create space for team members to ask questions, share their perspectives, and feel heard by leadership.
That makes them much more engaging and valuable for everyone involved. It's about fostering a sense of transparency and shared ownership.
Exactly. And it also reinforces that idea of radical candor as a culture, not just a set of techniques. It's about creating an environment where open and honest communication is the norm, not the exception.
So it's about those everyday interactions as well, that not just the formal meetings.
Absolutely. Kim Scott encourages leaders to find those informal opportunities to connect with their teams, whether it's, walking around the office, chatting with people at their desks, or grabbing lunch or coffee together.
Those informal moments can be so valuable. It's a chance to build rapport, get a sense of what's really going on,
Yeah.
and offer those small acts of radical candor that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It might be a quick word of encouragement, a piece of constructive feedback, or simply, listening attentively to someone who's having a tough day.
It's about being present and engaged with your team on a human level, not just a managerial level.
Right. And this ties back to the get stuff done wheel. Remember that last step? Learning. That applies to those everyday interactions as well.
So it's about being self-aware, paying attention to how your words and actions are landing, and constantly seeking feedback to improve your own communication style.
Exactly. Radical candor is an ongoing process of learning, refining, and growing, both for yourself as a leader and for your team as a whole.
This has been incredibly helpful. I'm starting to see how all these different elements of radical candor fit together,
Hmm.
to create a more positive and productive work environment.
Correct.
But I got to admit, I'm still a little intimidated by that challenging directly piece. I'm a naturally empathetic person, and I hate the thought of making someone uncomfortable.
I understand. It's natural to feel some hesitation about having those tough conversations, but remember, avoiding them can actually do more harm than good in the long run.
So how do we find that balance between being honest and direct without coming across as harsh or insensitive.
Yeah.
Are there specific phrases we can use, specific techniques to make those conversations more productive?
Those are great questions. And that's exactly what we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll unpack specific strategies for giving and receiving feedback in a way that fosters growth and strengthens relationships. But before we move on, I'm curious to hear what's resonating with you most so far. Is there anything in particular that you're eager to apply to your own leadership style?
Yeah, it's great that you're already thinking about, how this stuff applies to your team. We'll definitely get into more specific tactics for actually using these concepts soon.
Mhm.
But first, I want to kind of pick up on something you mentioned earlier, that feeling of being overwhelmed. Oh yeah, yeah, that's a constant struggle for sure. I'm really curious to hear what Kim Scott suggests about managing that, especially when it comes to leadership. It's like you have to be, on all the time.
She actually challenges that always on mentality instead of like striving for work-life balance, which can feel impossible. She talks about work-life integration.
That's an interesting distinction.
It-
I've always found the idea of balance to be a bit elusive. Like I'm constantly chasing this perfect equilibrium that never quite materializes.
Mm.
So what does work-life integration look like in practice?
It's about recognizing that work and life aren't, separate compartments. They're intertwined. It's about finding a rhythm that honors both without trying to force them into like perfectly equal portions.
So instead of trying to compartmentalize, it's more about finding a way to weave them together
Yeah.
in a way that feels, sustainable and authentic to your own life.
Exactly. And that might look different for everyone, of course. The key is to be intentional about how you structure your time and energy.
Speaking of energy, Kim Scott also talks about the importance of self-care for leaders, right?
Mm.
I can definitely see how that ties into this whole idea of work-life integration. But how do you actually do self-care when you're already feeling strapped for time?
She emphasizes the importance of scheduling personal time, even if it's, just a few minutes each day, and identifying activities that replenish you, whether it's exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, or something else entirely.
It's about being proactive,
Yeah.
right? And making those activities a non-negotiable part of your schedule,
Right.
rather than waiting until you're completely burned out and then trying to squeeze them in as an afterthought.
Precisely. And it's also about being honest with yourself and your team about your emotions.
That can be tough, though.
Mm.
Especially in a leadership role, there's often this pressure to project an image of, strength and composure.
I hear you. But Kim Scott argues that acknowledging your own vulnerability can actually strengthen your relationships and build trust. It shows your team that you're human, and it creates space for them to be more open about their own challenges.
It's like that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Hmm.
Showing your human side can actually make you a more effective leader.
Exactly. And this ties into another crucial aspect of radical candor, empowering your team. It's about shifting from a command and control leadership style to a more collaborative and trusting approach.
That makes sense. If you're constantly micromanaging and second guessing your team, you're basically sending the message that you don't trust their judgment.
Right, and that can stifle creativity, innovation, and ultimately their growth.
So how do we empower our teams in a way that aligns with the principles of radical candor?
One key step is to clearly define roles and responsibilities, making sure everyone understands how their individual contributions fit into the bigger picture.
That seems like a pretty basic step, but you'd be surprised how often it gets overlooked. When people don't understand their role, it can lead to like confusion, frustration, and duplicated effort.
Absolutely. And once those roles are clear, it's important to delegate effectively, giving people the authority to make decisions within their area of expertise.
That can be tough for some leaders, though.
Uh-huh.
Letting go of control can feel scary, especially if you're used to doing things a certain way.
It can, but remember, the goal isn't to control every aspect of your team's work. It's to create an environment where they can thrive, and that often means giving them the freedom to make their own decisions and learn from their mistakes.
It's about trusting them to figure things out, even if they don't do it exactly the way you would.
Exactly, and that's where that balance of caring personally and challenging directly, it comes into play again. You're not just throwing them into the deep end and hoping for the best. You're there to provide guidance, support, and feedback along the way.
It's about being a coach, not a dictator, right?
Right.
Helping them develop their skills and confidence while still holding them accountable for their performance.
Precisely. And this ties back to the concept of rock stars and superstars. Empowering your team allows each person to shine in their own way, whether they're seeking, stability or rapid growth.
It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued
Hmm.
and has the opportunity to contribute their unique strengths. But let's be honest, even with the best intentions, things don't always go smoothly, right? What about those situations where conflict arises within the team? How do we handle that in a way that aligns with radical candor?
That's a great question. Kim Scott really emphasizes the importance of addressing conflict directly and openly, rather than, sweeping it under the rug or hoping it'll just resolve itself.
But how do you do that without making things worse? Conflict can be so emotionally charged. It's easy for things to escalate quickly.
One helpful tip is to focus on the behavior or the issue at hand, rather than making it personal.
So instead of saying like you're always so negative, you might say, "I've noticed that you've expressed concerns about this project several times. Can you share more about your specific concerns?"
Exactly. That shifts the focus from attacking the person to understanding their perspective. And it's also
Huh.
crucial to encourage active listening.
So not just waiting for your turn to speak, but really trying to understand the other person's point of view,
Hmm.
even if you disagree with it.
Precisely. And that often involves, asking clarifying questions, summarizing what you've heard to make sure you understand, and validating their feelings even if you don't necessarily agree with their
It's
actions.
about it's about creating a safe space where people feel heard and respected, even when there's disagreement.
Exactly. And that's where those one-on-one meetings we discussed earlier, they can be incredibly valuable. They provide a dedicated time and space to have those deeper conversations, address concerns and build stronger
All
relationships.
right, those one-on-ones are not just for status updates. They're for connecting on a human level and
Mm.
building that foundation of trust that's essential for radical candor to work.
Hmm.
But I'm curious, how do we apply these principles to larger group meetings? We talked about staff meetings and decision-making meetings, but are there other types of meetings where radical candor can be particularly impactful?
Kim Scott also emphasizes the importance of all hands meetings.
Those big company-wide gatherings, I
Hmm.
I gotta admit, I usually dread those. They often feel like a one-way information dump.
Yeah, I hear you. But Kim Scott suggests using them as an opportunity for two-way communication, where leaders can share updates, of course, but also create space for team members to ask questions, share their perspectives, and feel heard by leadership.
That makes them much more engaging and valuable for everyone involved. It's about fostering a sense of transparency and shared ownership.
Exactly. And it also reinforces that idea of radical candor as a culture, not just a set of techniques. It's about creating an environment where open and honest communication is the norm, not the exception.
So it's about those everyday interactions as well, not just the formal meetings.
Absolutely. Kim Scott encourages leaders to find those informal opportunities to connect with their teams, whether it's, walking around the office, chatting with people at their desks, or grabbing lunch or coffee together.
Those informal moments can be so valuable. It's a chance to build rapport, get a sense of what's really going on, and offer those small acts of radical candor that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It might be a quick word of encouragement, a piece of constructive feedback, or simply, listening attentively to someone who's having a tough day.
It's about being present and engaged with your team on a human level, not just a managerial level.
Right. And this ties back to the get stuff done wheel. Remember that last step, learning. That applies to those everyday interactions as well.
So it's about being self-aware, paying attention to how your words and actions are landing, and constantly seeking feedback to improve your own communication style.
Exactly. Radical candor is an ongoing process of learning, refining, and growing, both for yourself as a leader and for your team as a whole.
This has been incredibly helpful. I'm starting to see how all these different elements of radical candor fit together to create a more positive and productive work environment. But I got to admit, I'm still a little intimidated by that challenging directly piece. I'm a naturally empathetic person, and I hate the thought of making someone uncomfortable.
I understand. It's natural to feel some hesitation about having those tough conversations. But remember, avoiding them can actually do more harm than good in the long run.
Right. So how do we find that balance between being honest and direct without coming across as harsh or insensitive? Are there specific phrases we can use, specific techniques to make those conversations more productive?
Those are great questions. And that's exactly what we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll unpack specific strategies for giving and receiving feedback in a way that fosters growth and strengthens relationships. But before we move on, I'm curious to hear what's resonating with you most so far. Is there anything in particular that you're eager to apply to your own leadership style?
Yeah, those techniques for giving feedback, especially for those, tougher conversations, that's what I'm really interested in. I mean, it's one thing to like understand radical candor,
Hmm?
but actually putting it into practice, it can feel kind of daunting.
You're right. It definitely takes some effort. But remember, the foundation is that combination of caring personally and challenging
Yeah.
directly, right? And that applies to how we give feedback as well.
So it's not just about being like blunt and honest. It's about doing it in a way that shows you actually care about the person and their growth,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. And that starts with self-awareness. Kim Scott really emphasizes the importance of understanding your own communication style, your strengths, weaknesses, any tendencies you might have that could hinder effective feedback.
That makes sense. If I'm not aware of my own, biases or blind spots,
Yeah.
I could unintentionally sabotage my efforts to be, radically candid.
Absolutely. It's about doing that inner work, that self-reflection, to make sure you're showing up as your most authentic and effective self in those conversations.
So it's like checking in with yourself before you, check in with someone else, making sure your own intentions are clear and that you're approaching the feedback from a place of genuine care.
Precisely. And it's also about being open to feedback yourself, even when it's, uncomfortable. Remember, radical candor is a two-way street.
Right. Right. We can't expect our team to be receptive to feedback if we're not willing to receive it ourselves. But I got to admit, receiving criticism, even constructive criticism, it can be tough. It's easy to like get defensive or take things personally.
It is, but think of feedback as a gift, even when it's wrapped in sandpaper. It's an opportunity to see ourselves from a different perspective, and identify areas for growth.
I love that analogy. It's a good reminder that even though feedback might sting a bit at first, it's ultimately a chance to become better leaders.
Exactly. Kim Scott offers some helpful strategies for receiving feedback gracefully. First, try to separate the feedback from the person who's delivering it. Remember, their intention is likely to help you, not to hurt you.
It's about focusing on the message, not the messenger,
Yeah.
and trying to assume good intent, even if the delivery isn't, perfect.
Right. Another tip is to ask clarifying questions, to make sure you fully understand the feedback. Sometimes getting more context can help you see things in a different light.
And it shows that you're genuinely interested in understanding their perspective, which can help, de-escalate any defensiveness you might be feeling.
Precisely. And finally, try to express gratitude for the feedback, even if it's difficult to hear. The person took the time and effort to share their thoughts with you, and that's something to be appreciated.
Those are all great tips for receiving feedback. But let's shift gears now and talk about how to deliver feedback effectively. That's the part I'm still a little nervous about, especially when it comes to those tougher conversations.
I understand it can feel daunting, especially when you're dealing with, sensitive issues or personality clashes. But remember that the key is to find that balance between honesty and empathy.
Okay, yeah, walk me through it. If I need to have a tough conversation with a team member, how do I approach it in a way that's both constructive and compassionate?
Kim Scott suggests a few steps. First, be clear about your intention. Make sure the person understands that you're giving them feedback because you care about their growth and development, not because you're, trying to punish them or humiliate them.
That's so important. Setting the right tone from the outset can make a huge difference.
It can. It really can. Another tip is to be specific. Don't just say you need to work on your communication skills. Give concrete examples of what you've observed and how it's impacting their work or the team.
That makes the feedback much more actionable, right? It gives
Yeah.
them something specific to work with rather than leaving them feeling, confused or defensive.
Exactly. And when you're giving feedback, focus on the behavior, not the person. So instead of saying, you're always late, say, I've noticed that you've been late to several meetings recently.
That's a subtle but important distinction. It helps to depersonalize the feedback
Hmm.
and make it less about, attacking their character and more about addressing a specific issue.
Precisely. And finally, be open to hearing their perspective. Remember, feedback is a two-way conversation. Give them the opportunity to share their thoughts, their feelings, and any challenges they might be facing.
It's about creating a dialogue, not delivering a monologue, and really listening to understand, not just to respond.
Exactly. By listening attentively and responding with empathy, you can strengthen the relationship and make the feedback even more impactful.
This is all so helpful. I'm feeling more confident about having those challenging conversations now. But what about those situations where things get heated? What if someone reacts, emotionally to the feedback, even if it's delivered with the best of intentions?
That can definitely happen. Not everyone is comfortable receiving feedback, no matter how skillfully it's delivered. In those situations, it's important to stay calm, listen attentively, and avoid getting defensive yourself.
Easier said than done, right? It's natural to want to defend yourself when you feel attacked, even if the attack isn't intended.
It is, but remember, the goal isn't to win an argument. It's to help the person understand your perspective and find a way to move forward together.
So it's about de-escalating the situation
Yeah.
and finding common ground.
Exactly. Sometimes that might mean, taking a break, giving the person some space to process their emotions, and then coming back to the conversation later when things have cooled down.
That's a great strategy.
Oh.
It allows everyone to regroup and approach the conversation with a clearer head.
And remember, radical candor, it's a journey, not a destination. It's a skill that takes time and practice to develop. Don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way. The most important thing is to approach it with a genuine desire to care for and challenge your team, helping them to grow and achieve their full potential.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I'm feeling, inspired and equipped to start implementing these principles in my own leadership approach.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you. And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue this journey, read the book, check out the YouTube summary, and most importantly, start putting these ideas into practice with your own teams. You might be surprised at the positive impact it has on your relationships, your work environment, and your results.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.